Recently, I featured a small form factor HP 800G2 in a video where I upgraded it and tested it with both a low-profile GTX 1650 and an RX 6400. As expected, the system handled 1080p modern gaming reasonably well on lower settings with the assistance of upscaling. Overall, the configuration provided what could be considered a quality gaming experience for users with reasonable expectations. However, the main issues with the GPUs I used are their availability and cost. The low-profile GTX 1650 is difficult to obtain and typically costs nearly $200 in the US. The RX 6400, being a relatively recent release, retains its value well and usually ranges from $120 to $160, both used and new. Today, I wanted to explore a more realistic, lower-end, and much cheaper alternative, the AMD Radeon RX 550. The low-profile RX 550 I have here is an OEM model with 4GB of GDDR5 video memory. I purchased it for $35 a few months ago on eBay, though this particular model generally sells for closer to $40 more consistently. Despite its low price, it offers 2 more gigabytes of VRAM than most other RX 550 models and is compatible with small form factor computers like my 800G2 system. The RX 550, released in 2017, is built with the GCN 4.0 architecture and a 14nm process size. It is one of the lowest tier cars in the Polaris series, which also includes more well-known GPUs like the RX 570 and RX 580. While the RX 550 has pretty low specs, it offers GDDR5 speeds, native DirectX 12 support, and a TDP of just 50 watts, making it compatible with very low-end systems. Additionally, my model's 4GB of VRAM provides a bit of extra headroom, which proves useful for gaming, as you'll see. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another similar GPU, the Radeon Pro WX 3100. The two are very comparable on paper and perform similarly in games based on my research and experience. The main difference is that the WX 3100 is slightly more optimized for workstation-like tasks and may lag slightly behind the RX 550 in gaming. While this card could be a viable alternative to the RX 550, it generally comes at a similar cost used on eBay. For testing, I'll be using the same setup that I used in my previous video with the 800G2 system. It has a 4-core, 8-threaded i7 6700, 32GB of DDR4 running at a speed of 21 to 33 MHz, and Windows 10 and all games running off a SATA SSD. I had some fun with this round of testing, trying out various presets and tweaks to see the best and worst case scenarios at different resolutions to ascertain if this GPU is even worth being considered in a super budget system. I did not end up testing the RX 550 in any sort of esports games, mainly because they aren't as interesting or fun for me to test. However, generally speaking, many esports titles are lighter on hardware, and I can reasonably deduce that the RX 550 may be able to handle many games like Fortnite and CS2, given that the graphics settings are dialed down. I may make a follow-up video testing esports title with this GPU if there's enough interest. But sticking with both old and new AAA titles, the game I ran first was the legendary Grand Theft Auto 5. In 1080p at the normal settings, I was able to see an average of 84 FPS, with percentile lows in the 50s and 60s, making for a very smooth run. Even at these settings, we were already using over 2GB of VRAM, which is pretty consistently the case throughout all this testing, making me curious how the 2GB version would fare. Anyways, I bumped up the settings to high, which helps some textures and details look a bit better at the cost of cutting the frame rate in half. With an average of 40 FPS, the game is completely playable and still stable enough with no noticeable dips. To really push the 550, I maxed out all the settings to the very high and ultra options and yielded a test run with an average of 27 FPS. There is some noticeable artifacting, and to be honest, this is one of the worst looking outputs I've seen for the max settings on GTA 5 at 1080p in terms of graphic fidelity. But to be fair to the RX 550, most low-end cards would not even be able to function under these circumstances and still achieve near a 30 FPS average. Sticking with Rockstar titles, I fired up Red Dead Redemption 2 and was actually pretty surprised by how the RX 550 handled the game. To start, I set the settings to the lowest with FSR enabled and set the resolution to 720p. This output, being pretty tough to look at, was smooth and fairly stable with 48 FPS. To help add some clarity to the visuals, I upped the resolution to 1080p while maintaining the same settings. These are probably the most playable settings for the RX 550 with an average of 33 FPS in and around the Strawberry area in-game. Just for fun, I maxed out the quality slider to the maximum recommended settings based on my hardware with native 1080p and TAA. This led to a pretty visually solid output and an average FPS in the mid-20s while getting the closest we've gotten to that VRAM limit so far. The next game I tried out was Skyrim, simply because I think this GPU is likely best for playing 7th and early 8th generation console era titles, and Skyrim happens to be one of the greatest of that generation. This game has a 60 FPS cap, so I left it at the recommended ultra quality preset in 1080p. While averaging frame rates in the mid-30s in most environments, the range was pretty big, with dips as low as 20 to getting around over 50 FPS in the easier to run areas of the game. At these settings, the game runs fine and would offer no major issues while playing this slower paced single player title. In Witcher 3 with the next gen patch, the RX 550 really dropped the ball. I had to accept running this one at 720p low preset, where it both looked better and ran smoother with FSR disabled, averaging 33 FPS without it and 26 FPS with it. I didn't even bother trying out 1080p with this game because frankly it was pretty rough just navigating through the menus at the higher resolution and would likely have absolutely tanked the frame rates. In another CD Projekt Red game, Cyberpunk 2077, the outcomes were pretty wide ranged. At 900p with FSR set to performance, I was seeing a very consistent 30 FPS average, even in the more intensive areas. After jumping up to 1080p with the lowest settings and no FSR, where I forgot to reset my FPS counter, I was seeing numbers around 20 FPS while the game looked a whole lot better. Lastly, I maxed out the settings and employed FSR quality to achieve an expected choppy test run with an average, albeit a very stable average, of about 12 FPS. Next up, I ran Horizon Zero Dawn at 900p and FSR quality with the favorite performance preset selected. This led to frame rates hovering in the low 40s. The gameplay was alright with this one, though the video memory usage was very consistently jumping up to the 3800 to 3900 megabyte range. Just to see how the performance would change, I ran the game in 1080p at the performance preset again, but this time in the native resolution with no FSR. This resulted in frames sticking to the low to mid 20s, but a pretty substantial visual improvement in exchange. The last title I ran was the 2023 release, Hogwarts Legacy. This is actually one of my favorites to test because it usually runs surprisingly well on lower end hardware like this, in my experience, as long as you have plenty of system memory. This was the game where FSR perhaps made the biggest difference, where at 1080p low preset with FSR balanced, I was getting a pretty consistent average of about 33 FPS no matter where I went in the game. Alternatively, at the same settings in native 1080p, performance tanked to the upper teens, making the bump in graphics nowhere near worth the cost. Regarding small form factor compatible GPUs, the RX 550 likely offers more performance for the price compared to both the RX 6400 and GTX 1650, which I tested in the previous upload. However, I have a feeling that there are still better options out there, which I'd like to explore in future tests. If you want to stay updated on further testing or enjoy videos testing budget hardware, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And if you have any hardware recommendations for me to test or questions to share, feel free to leave a comment. As always, thank you for watching.